The McIlvaney Weekly Commentary, covering monetary, economic, and geopolitical news events. Now here are Kevin Orrick and David McIlvaney.
Welcome to the McIlvaney Weekly Commentary. I'm Kevin Orrick along with David McIlvaney. David, last week we had John Williams on the program, and of course, again, as promised, we have him on this week. The subject was hyperinflation, as much as we'd like to avoid it.
The funny thing is that, that classic quote of, how did you go broke? Very slowly and then all at once. That really captures that idea of hyperinflation, where it didn't appear on anyone's radar screen, and then all of a sudden it was the state of affairs. There was no sort of gradual slippage. And you saw that in Germany, going from a 6% in 1918 to 100% in 1919, and then into the thousands of percents per year, but a very rapid acceleration. And one thing we want to talk about, John, as we enter conversation today, is on the velocity of money, being either an indication of a return to economic health as it picks up, or it's spinning out of control as people are dumping their currency, and it spins out of control, and velocity, ends up being a multiple of what anyone could expect it to be. John, this last year on our film, one of the things that we talked about was the importance of the velocity of money. And, essentially velocity is flat. The transmission mechanism, the central banks can print, and they've created a tremendous amount of liquidity. But what we find is that excess reserves are being held with the Fed. There's not a lot of circulation of the liquidity printed or the liquidity provided into the larger economy. You might see velocity pick up if the economy was picking up, but you could also see velocity spin out of control and rapidly ramp up in a hyperinflation. How would you suggest we view velocity conceptually? How would it be a helpful tool for us to anticipate sort of entering the next round of inflation, super, or even hyperinflation?
Well, conceptually, the velocity is very important. I mean, it's the velocity, the number of times that the money supply turns over in the economy, that is part of the basic formula that relates economic and inflation activity to the growth in the money supply. Very difficult to measure because it's a residual. The GNP numbers are worthless, or the GDP numbers are worthless. They're so heavily modeled. It's, as I mentioned earlier, just to take a look at what's happening with payroll numbers is an indication of relative economic activity. The GDP, as it gets reported, is net of inflation. But the inflation numbers are underestimated deliberately, and the methodologies have been changed to reduce reported inflation. If inflation were accurately reported, the inflation-adjusted GDP would have shown a deeper decline and absolutely no recovery. I mean, the official GDP right now actually is higher than it was before the economy turned down. But it's challenging to find any other economic statistics that show that pattern. It hasn't happened. It's all in the gimmicked way that GDP is reporting. So you divide that by the money supply, and the best amount that the government does right now is report M2. I still follow the old M3, which was at the time their broader measure. They used to report an L measure, included private holdings of Treasury bills. They not continued reporting on that, but with the M3, even with the M3, there are issues in terms of what's being measured here. And when you're dealing with the world's reserve currency, you also have to consider the money supply that's sitting outside the system, sitting outside the United States. And where M3 right now is maybe around $14 trillion, there's at least a $7 trillion overhang of dollars that can be dumped into our system. And you have to consider that a little bit in terms of how that works into the overall velocity picture. But basically what you're talking about, it's a basic number. The faster the velocity turns over, people don't want to hold the dollars. That becomes a key element of the hyperinflation. And again, when we already be seeing that, consider that there's no, within the traditional spectrum of investments sold by Wall Street, there's no safe investment out there where an investor can put his money and beat inflation, even as reported by the U.S. government. That type of a circumstance, you do better to take your cash and go out and buy the consumer goods that are inflating, because at least you'll keep up with inflation on them, and you'll be ahead of what you'd get on a Treasury bill. And you're beginning to see a little bit of that. That tends to spike the velocity. Again, there's no easy way to measure it. It's a matter of really having to look at it anecdotally as to whether or not it's picking up. But there will be a rapid pickup here, again, as we see the panic decline. Globally, dumping of the dollars. No one wants to hold the dollars. You'll see that beginning in the U.S. as well. And as that pace accelerates, the velocity will be a major factor driving the prices higher.
Well, and you're talking about not only M3, but the international supply of U.S. dollars, which the $14 trillion plus the $21 trillion total would be a basic footprint for greenbacks. Now, of course, you're talking about a multiple of that, depending on how fast it goes through the economy. So 21 times 2, 21 times 3, 21 times 5, however many times that $21 trillion is being circulated. That is, in fact, what can be deceptive at the front edge of a hyperinflation, because with that increase in transactions, if you will, you're seeing business return to quote-unquote normal, but it's not actually a normal. It's, again, like the surfer who thinks he's got the perfect wave, not realizing it's a tsunami. He's going to enjoy it.
Well, it isn't even necessarily returning to normal, and there's an important point here in terms of inflation. There are a couple of kinds of inflation, the way the consumers see it, and the healthy kind is when you do have a strong economy and people have money and they're out spending and there's more money chasing too few goods. That's a relatively happy circumstance. Production increases. Those are good economic times, even though you may have higher inflation. Then you have the not-so-happy inflation, which is what Mr. Bernanke's been creating. And again, you go back to, we have to go back, I guess, to 2002 when the Fed chairman got his nickname as Helicopter Ben. He made a speech on how the Fed could always prevent a deflation. There was a fear of returning. When they talk deflation, or the fear of deflation, the fear there is of the type of deflation that was seen during the Great Depression, where prices dropped maybe a third in aggregate. And that reflected the contraction in the money supply. The money supply contracted a third. And the reason you had that terrible deflation, although there are people argue that deflation has positive elements to it as well. I'm not getting into the merits of deflation or inflation here, but just how that works mechanically. The reason you had that sharp decline in prices was because of the collapse in the banking system, and with a number of people having cash in the banks actually losing their deposits. They no longer had the money they thought they had, that they had on deposit with a bank that failed. In the current era where you have the FDIC and the Fed steps in, or the Treasury steps in the crisis such as you had in 2008 and pretty much guarantee everything there, then the people holding cash in banks are covered. But as they lost the cash, that created a collapse in the money supply. The debt crisis didn't crash the money supply. So it's a little different. If a bank lends $1 million, you spend that in the system, it goes all over the place, and in theory, if the system is operating normally, which we haven't seen in some years, that $1 million will end up as $10 million of money supply. Then you default on your loan to the bank comes to you, they say, give me back the $1 million. You say, I'm sorry, I can't do it. The bank can't go into the system and pull out of the system that $1 million or the $10 million in the money supply that $1 million created. So it doesn't contract the money supply. What it does, though, is it hurts the balance sheet of the bank. And as the bank's balance sheet takes a hit, its ability to lend is reduced. And that's part of the reason behind the lack of bank lending, lack of growth in bank lending that we're still seeing. Very, very weak. And that is the reason we're not seeing the growth in bank lending is because the banks are not stable. They're not long-term solvent, or the system isn't. So they're not lending the money and slowed the money supply, but now the money supply is growing, and I can tell you in the last numbers that we've tracked with M3 were the highest level in, something like 28 months. And the most recent numbers are suggesting it's beginning to spike a little bit.
There's concerns both domestic, and you mentioned that. I mean, something as basic as food delivery and what can happen on the basis of that causing civil disorder in the event of a super or hyperinflation. Now, we also live in a world where the U.S. dollar is the reserve currency, and there are over 50 countries that are dollarized, actually use the U.S. dollar. What are the geopolitical implications for these dollarized countries and for our foreign relationships as we move towards a hyperinflationary endgame?
It's not going to be very good for those countries that are dollarized or those that try to peg to the dollar. They'll be suffering the same type of debasement in the currency that we'll be seeing here. You'll see all sorts of effects. I mean, there's some moaning and groaning in China about importing inflation from U.S. monetary policy. Well, that's because they're still pegging their currency to the dollar to a certain extent, and as the dollar sinks, and this is where the inflation comes in. I sort of got distracted there. But as the dollar declines, and we've got plenty of dollar selling ahead of us. Right now we're seeing an artificial propping of the currency, but as the dollar declines, you have commodities such as oil that are denominated in dollars, and the way the effect works through in the markets is that the dollar decline will tend to spike prices in dollar terms. That becomes inflationary to us. The inflation that we've seen in the United States over the last year, the pickup there, I mean, we're still up now maybe 3.5% year over year. It's got a long ways to go to the upside, but that is not because of any underlying strength in the economy. It's largely due to higher gasoline prices, which are not due to strong demand. It's due to the dollar distortion and the fortunate spike in oil prices. The higher oil prices also are working their way into the broad economy. I mean, I can't think of any commodity more important than oil in terms of its impact on consumer inflation. Any goods that get transported, driving energy, the pharmaceutical industry is a lot of its materials based on that, the chemical industry, fertilizers, plastics, all that's tied to the price of oil. And Bernanke has liked to push the concept of core inflation, which is it's the inflation measure net of inflation and food and energy. Absolute nonsense to look at that on a long-term basis because those are two of the most important components of consumption for individuals. I mean, if you want to look at it on a monthly basis and say, oh, yeah, that was a big jump this month, but that's because oil prices were up or food prices were up, that's a legitimate consideration. But when you look at it on a year-over-year basis, you're no longer looking at short-term distortions. And guess what? If you look at the core CPI as published by the government, it started turning up when Mr. Bernanke started to jawbone the dollar lower before QE2. And it has risen every month, year over year, since then. And we're likely going to see another jump of that in the month of December, which is, as we're talking, is just ahead of us. It is spreading throughout the economy. And this next round of inflation, the weakness in the dollar will be much more severe in terms of its effect on commodities and costs. People have to go to work. They're going to buy gasoline. They may not go for leisurely drives in the country, but it's going to be cutting into their available income. And they're going to be turning that cash, whatever cash they have, over faster and faster to just try and stay even, let alone gain in what people could hope for is a healthy economy. But we're not going to have a healthy economy as we go into this.
Just a reminder, you're listening to the McAlvany Weekly Commentary at McAlvany.com. McAlvany.com.
Let me ask you just to peg a probability as we look at 2012 and see that there has been very little political will to address the circumstances that we're in from a fiscal and economic standpoint. What do you think the probabilities are of our government leaders and the folks both between Washington and New York kicking the can down the road, specifically into 2013, past the election? Can we see them buy time for 12 months, or is the probability too great of seeing this domino effect from Europe?
Well, they'd certainly like to kick the can that far down the road. I'll contend they can't. They'll try, but in order to be able to do that, they still have to get people to buy the Treasury funding needs, which they're having trouble doing to what the Fed did all that in the last year. And they find that the Fed has to come in and become the lender of last resort to the U.S. government. The hyperinflation follows very quickly with that. And along with that, the rest of the world is dumping the dollar. What's distorting the dollar right now is the distraction of the problems in Europe. That will pass. we'll do whatever, and when I say we, the Federal Reserve, the U.S. players in this, will do whatever is necessary to protect the U.S. banking system from collapse in that. But as the European situation eases back and the markets begin to say, gee, what's going on here? The elephant in the bathtub is the dollar. I mean, people have been missing that. They started to see it in August. I mean, we could have been off to the races at that point in time. But again, and you can expect that there will be interventions, sleight of hand, all sorts of things that will come into play, but it doesn't change the underlying fundamentals. They don't have to 2015 where keep the markets at bay. The global markets will turn here on the dollar. They're very close to doing so. And if you're OPEC, and this is where the dollarized countries come in too, if the dollar is going to be debased, and that's the policy of the Fed, that's what Mr. Bernanke wanted to do. So we can always prevent deflation. We can prevent what you had was the fear of the 30s and the effects of the banking system collapse. We can always prevent, with the central bank working in concert with the sovereign power, they can always debase the currency, create inflation. They can. It's easy for them to create inflation or to knock the economy to hell. The negatives are easy to do. What's very tough to do is to contain the inflation and to stimulate the economy. Fed can't do either of those at the moment. The actions that it takes are aimed at maintaining banking system solvency, and all the talk about stimulating the economy is just fluff for popular consumption and acceptance of the policies.
We've seen the Saudi oil minister raise the expected oil price from $75 a barrel to $100 a barrel just this week, and it was, I think, back in 2008 that they contended 75 was sufficient, and that's what they would target. Now they say 100 is sufficient, and that's what they'll target. I think you're right. What we are seeing from the 2008 to 2011 period is an adjustment, if you will, an accommodation of lower dollar values and dollar instability, anticipating that into the future, reflecting on a per barrel basis. Let me ask you a quick question on just our domestic politics, and then we'll wrap up. We are in an election year. We should see some statistics absolutely tortured to sing the song that they're supposed to, whether it's for the incumbent. We're interested in, if this is 2013, 2014, an era of hyperinflation, we're talking about the political party that wins. It will probably be anathema for the next 10 to 20 to 30 years. It really isn't a time to go out and pursue victory, is it?
Well, this could break before the election. You have all sorts of unusual things at play here. Over the last century, the elections generally were presidential elections were very predictable given income growth, net of inflation. And at least in the way it used to be measured, whenever disposable income, the take-home pay of the average individual was above 3.2%, the incumbent party retained the White House. And when it was below 3.2%, the incumbent party lost the White House. And that worked consistently over time. We're seeing no growth in disposable income now, net of inflation. This is a type of environment that with two parties, Mr. Obama would be facing forced retirement at the end of the year early in 2012. That's just due to the economy. The economy hurt George Bush. It's one reason that Obama was elected. But what we're seeing here is so severe and so painful that it can bring about unusual change. Enough so that the establishment guys may have some surprises. And I say the establishment guys. Governments are corrupt. They have been as far back as governments have existed. And as long as people are doing well, the average person doesn't seem to care too much. But once they start feeling economic pain, they tend to look very closely at the people running the circumstance. And that's when the guys that have been having a great time there run into some trouble. This is a type of environment that if there's no real change offered by either major party, that you could have a third party come to the fore and maybe knock either the Republicans or the Democrats into third party status. My betting is that we're probably not going to see a change in the establishment kind of president in this election, which will, again, just accelerate and doom the process for the hyperinflation. If you had someone who could today go in and actually argue for the change and make changes and talk honestly to the American people, say, hey, look, we're bankrupt. This has been a problem with both parties over the years. We've gone beyond our means if we don't bring it under control now. The style of life, our financial world as we know it, is not going to survive. We've got to make painful cuts that are going to affect almost everyone in this circumstance. The American people could understand and rally around. They already sense there's a problem. If that's not addressed by the major parties, you're going to have a third party. I don't know if it's going to be powerful enough to make the change, but if you can get a real shift there where instead of lacking the political will to address the system, you have the political will to overhaul it, maybe there's something that can be done there to forestall it. I don't see it happening, but I mean, it would be good if it could. I think I mentioned this with you last time we talked. So I've only been physically assaulted once for my views here, and that was by a very nice lady, elderly lady at a bank board meeting up in Maine, and she broke into tears. She said, "Oh, all you have here is bad news. Where's the good news?" And she was so upset. She took this jelly donut and she threw it at me, hit me right in the middle of the chest. She had a very good arm. And before I could say anything, the bank chairman stepped in. He said, "The good news is, you know what's happening, and if you know what's happening, you can protect yourself." If I saw a way the government could actually resolve this, I thought there was a chance of it, I'd be out pushing that real hard. I don't see it happening. I mean, there's a chance, but if I had to put the odds on it, it's not going to. Which means I'm out talking about how you can protect yourself. And that's what the individual's got to look at here. The system, I think, has gone too far to right itself within the day-to-day politics that we've seen for the last 30, 40 years. It will become self-righting as the system gets into this terrible financial turmoil. Individuals hopefully will be able to ride the storm, and they can do that by looking to preserve their wealth and assets. I look at physical gold, such as sovereign coins, as a primary hedge there, getting some assets outside the U.S. dollar. It's going to be primarily a U.S. dollar problem, getting into stronger currencies. My goodness, you look at when you see artificial intervention, those things don't last and usually provide an opportunity for people who are betting against the intervention. The Swiss franc, Canadian dollar, Australian dollar, the ones I look at as being stronger. If you can protect your assets, keep them liquid, ride out the storm, then you're in a position to not only have survived, but you'll be in a position to make some very unusual investments and such after the fact, or you'll be happy that you're able to maintain your assets and liquidity. If we don't get something like the Ron Paul bill, which gives you backup to the dollar, and again, my betting is you're not going to see anything there. You also need to look at personal safety. I mean, if the grocery store shelves get cleaned out, you should have a stock of canned food, like you might for a natural disaster. I'm crazy enough to be sitting here on the Hayward Fault in California. I didn't come out here to sit on the Hayward Fault. I came out here to be close to family, and we discussed these issues, but I am nonetheless here. And beyond whatever I'm looking at from the financial standpoint, I do have a stock of goods that would see me through an earthquake. But you should look at that as you should look at disasters that can hit you and where you need to be prepared and have a basic store of goods that will get you through a couple of months before, let's say, a barter system would kick in or whatever. Do that for a man-made disaster as well as a natural disaster. Use stuff that you can circulate. I mean, you turn the inventories over. There's very little cost to that. And in fact, in an inflationary environment, which we are now, when you look at consumer goods against what you can get in the way of return on a T-bill, you're actually saving money.
John, we appreciate you joining us again, and we will certainly want to have this conversation again before we get to that outside of 2014. And there's a story to be told within the statistics that you look at, and we want our clients and listeners to be well advised ahead of time to make the requisite choices, the needed choices, so that they're not surprised and held captive by being on the wrong side of things, forced to play the patience game and wait it out. We, again, look forward to the future conversation and appreciate your contribution. Shadowstats.com is where our listeners can go and download the Hyperinflation Special Report. Again, that's shadowstats.com. and looking at last year's is of some value, of great value, in fact, but would encourage you to subscribe to the service and look at the updated, and that'll be out just here in the next few days. So, John, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, David, I think the summary of what John was saying is, in a way, it's a little bit spooky. He's talking about hyperinflation, but he also has made a very clear point, both last week and this week, that this is probably unsolvable with any political solution.
Well, Kevin, there are political solutions, but they're not on offer. And that's what I think we're missing in terms of the stock of folks who are coming into the election cycle this time around. You would have to go back to the Harding administration. You would have to consider cutting the budget by 50%. You would have to take dramatic action, Kevin, to see a major fix on the fiscal side of things. And that's why we see this correction, Kevin, as primarily a correction via the currency. And we translate hyperinflation or superinflation as correcting the financial excesses of the last 20 to 30 years via an adjustment in the currency to a much lower value.
Well, and honestly, David, this show is not really trying to correct the country's problem or the world's problem. So we're too small for that. But what we can do is we can talk to each listener and say exactly what John Williams said, and that is, if it can't be solved politically, and it may not be able to be solved economically on the large scale, you have to protect yourself. You have to preserve your assets and not just survive, but just like John Williams said, maybe thrive, maybe be able to have pennies on the dollar types of buys on the other side of this tunnel.
Well, I think having an open mind, Kevin, and being willing to take certain actions now just makes sense. As he said, it is very common sense when you live in California to prepare for an earthquake, because these things do happen. Yet you live your day hoping for the best, prepared for the worst, and being ready for anything. And that's, I think, the way we need to enter 2012 and 2013.
Well, you've been listening to the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. I'm Kevin Orrick along with David McAlvany. You can find us at McAlvany.com, McAlvany.com, or give us a call anytime at 800-525-9556.
This has been the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. The views expressed should not be considered to be a solicitation or a recommendation for your investment portfolio. You should consult a professional financial advisor to assess your suitability for risk and investment. Join us again next week for a new edition of the McAlvany Weekly Commentary.